Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. Got a great show today. Coming up in a little bit, we're going to be speaking with Ron Ness. He's the president of the North Dakota Petroleum Council. His organization, along with another group, just put out a study indicating that about 50% over the last 5 fiscal years, and this is an amazing number, about 50% of all tax revenues collected by the state of North Dakota came from the oil and gas industry. Now that figure alone is pretty remarkable, and they're basing the report on publicly available data. But it's even more amazing when you consider the fact that they're not what's not counted in the report are indirect tax revenues driven by the oil and gas industry. Now, when I say indirect revenues, what I'm talking about essentially is things like sales tax revenues. As we saw when oil prices fell and oil activity fell, we saw a pretty significant decline in the amount of sales tax revenue that our state collected. And that's because sales tax revenue was driven pretty heavily by oil activity, right? All those workers coming into Western North Dakota, they were spending money that was driving sales taxes. All the companies coming into Western North Dakota to not just, work directly in the oil fields, but also to serve, all those workers and the oil field companies, they drove sales tax revenues. They all drove income tax revenues, corporate income tax revenues. We're not counting any of that. If we just look at the extraction and production taxes alone, that is 50% of all the revenues drawn in to the state of North Dakota's coffers over the last 5 fiscal years. I think it's like 44. If you go back 10 years, it's like 44%. Remarkable numbers. Ron Ness on to talk a little bit about that. And during our interview, we talk about a couple of ways in which that affects policymaking in North Dakota. One is when we talk about other taxes, right? When we talk about, oh, hey, we want to get rid of the income tax, or, oh, hey, we want to get rid of property taxes. The reality of those things is that they narrow the tax base. And if they narrow the tax base, we're putting more eggs in that oil basket. And oil, even you'll hear Mr. Ness acknowledge, is not going to be here forever. The oil play may be over. It may be a long time. It may be 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but it's not going to be here forever. And so there's concern about putting all our eggs in one basket for that reason. And the fact that even if we don't run out of oil, the market conditions could change. Right? Oil prices could fall again. We could find something that's better than oil, right? We have emerging energy technologies. If something comes along that's better than oil, we may not need it so much anymore. So we have a lot of that going on. Anyway, stay tuned for that interview with Ron Ness. But before we get to that, I want to discuss a little bit because you'll be listening to this podcast Monday, but I'm recording it Sunday. And this Sunday, I have been spending some time on Twitter going back and forth with State Representative Karla Rose Hanson. She's a Democrat from Fargo who was kind enough to come on this program previously to discuss her red flag law. Now, on Twitter, Representative Hanson was responding to something that I wrote. There was a letter to the editor that kind of took a shot at me and my criticism of the red flag law. And before we get into I'm talking about this too much, I should explain to you if you haven't been following what the red flag law is. The legislation specifically is HB 1537. It has the backing of several law enforcement officials in the state. It has the backing of some Republican lawmakers in addition to Democratic lawmakers. It is a bipartisan bill. And I oppose it. And the reason why I oppose it is because it allows law enforcement or even like friends or family to initiate a proceeding whereby a person is denied their guns, right? Their guns are taken away from them. Their gun rights are denied to them. And then there's a hearing. So the plaintiffs, it's a civil proceeding, and the plaintiffs in the civil proceeding, whether it's initiated by law enforcement or friends and family, the plaintiffs, so to say, they get their remedy immediately. They get the guns taken away. The defendant in the case, the person who is to be adjudicated as being too dangerous to have their gun rights, they have to show up in court and essentially defend themselves. They have to show up in court and defend themselves and prove that they are not dangerous and that, in fact, they should have their gun rights restored. Now, I have a problem with that. I have a problem with taking somebody's weapons away preemptively before there's even been an adjudication. I am against the idea of taking somebody's guns away, basically denying them a civil right, right? I mean, because that's what it is. In the United States of America, keeping and bearing arms is a civil right. It's a constitutional right. It's the Second Amendment. We're going to deny that to them based on what they might do. Now, the letter to the editor accused me of wanting to wait around until something bad happens before we take someone's guns away. And my response to that is waiting around until something bad happens is also called innocence until proven guilty. Because that's the standard in the United States of America. We don't deny people their rights until, they've been adjudicated to have actually done something worthy of denying them their rights. Now, the response from Representative Hanson, she's coming back and she is saying, well, we can already involuntarily commit people. And so this must be okay as well, right? Because we can already say that somebody's having some sort of a psychotic episode and there's a legal process in place in which we can involuntarily commit them and deny them their liberty to move about, right? I mean, there's no question you would voluntarily commit somebody, you are denying them liberty. No question about that. And that process does exist. And it does meet constitutional muster. But it's also based on the judgment of a medical professional. It's not used very often. In fact, most of the time, medical professionals like people to be voluntarily committed, right? Because how are you going to help somebody who doesn't want to be helped, right? That's the first step, I think, is getting the person to recognize that they need help. And that's a much different process. Also, there's a process that's in place for that before the person is just involuntarily committing. Also, that lasts for 72 hours. HB 1537 would allow the courts to take the guns away from somebody for up to a year. And towards the end of the term for which they're going to have their guns denied from them, the court can have another hearing and re-up. They could essentially deny you your gun rights indefinitely. So I have a problem with that. But another problem that occurred to me that I think is worth talking about, that's worth thinking about, is that Representative Hanson keeps, and you could follow, if you go follow me on Twitter at Rob Port, you could probably track down our exchange, and it might be worth your time to read. But what Representative Hanson is saying, she keeps saying that this is a civil proceeding, right? It's not a criminal proceeding. It's a civil proceeding. And I think that's important because if you think about it, if it was a criminal proceeding, you, the individual who is being accused of being too dangerous to exercise your constitutional rights, would have right to indigent counsel, right? In a criminal proceeding, you're guaranteed a right to an attorney. We all remember that from the famous Miranda warning, right? That's in movies and television that law enforcement reads out to people when they're under arrest. You have a right to a lawyer. You have a right to counsel. Not necessarily in a civil proceeding. If the state initiates a civil proceeding against you, you may not have that right. So imagine this. Imagine that somebody decides that you are too dangerous to own a weapon. And whether it's law enforcement or a friend or family or something, they initiate this proceeding against you. You now are in the position of A, needing to defend the fact that you're not too dangerous to have your Second Amendment rights. And again, this is important stuff. These are rights. This is not some state-delegated privilege, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why I'm really reacting negatively to this legislation, because I feel like we're treating gun rights as though they were a privilege, a government-delegated privilege, as opposed to a right. I mean, it's one thing to have a civil proceeding, which we do. If you get a DUI in this state, which I have, unfortunately, if you get a DUI in this state, the state initiates a civil action against you by which they deny you your driving privileges. That is not a criminal action. That actually runs, there is a criminal action initiated against you as well for breaking the crime of driving under the influence, but there is a separate civil action that is initiated against you to suspend your driving privileges. Because they could do that in a civil proceeding because it is a privilege. I don't like the idea that we're treating gun rights like a privilege. They are not a privilege. Gun rights are a right. The same as saying what you want, speaking freely, the First Amendment. The same as the right to the free press, the same as your right to religion. So I don't like that. But in this proceeding, essentially, they initiate this civil proceeding against you. Your obligation under this proceeding is to show up and prove that you're not dangerous and that you can, in fact, have your weapons. And to do that, you have to go out and hire your own lawyer or represent yourself, which, what's the old saying that the person who represents themselves in court has a fool for a client? Lawyers don't even represent themselves in court. Lawyers, when they are sued, typically get another lawyer to represent them. It's just a good idea. But in this proceeding, you better be able to afford your own lawyer or you're going to be stuck defending yourself. In a proceeding in which your guilt has essentially already been determined. They've already taken your weapons away from you. That's what they can do under HB 1537. They can take away your guns before you even get a chance to get in court and defend yourself. And now to get them back, you got to win the case. May not be so easy. The other thing I don't like this is how broad this is about what can be considered. I mean, essentially anything can be considered, right? I mean, if you forget to feed your dog, and you get a citation for animal cruelty, they could say that's evidence that this person is dangerous. They're a danger to themselves. They've got a dangerous mind. Another thing that I've been thinking about recently is what about veterans? Now, there tends to be, just demographically speaking, and I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I think we can all agree, demographically speaking, there's a pretty broad overlap between veterans and gun owners, right? There's a lot of veterans who value their Second Amendment rights, who practice their Second Amendment rights. They're concealed carry holders, they're target shooters, they're hunters, they're sports people, what have you. A lot of veterans practice their Second Amendment rights. They value their gun owners. They value their Second Amendment rights. A lot of veterans also struggle with PTSD. Now, a big fight that we've had in our society in the United States of America is removing some of the stigma from that, removing some of the stigma from acknowledging that you struggle with that. Because in years past, admitting to the idea that you might be struggling with something like PTSD was seen to be like admitting that you're crazy, admitting that there's something wrong with you, admitting that you might be a problematic person. And we've worked really hard to remove a lot of that stigma, to say, no, this is okay. You can struggle with these things and still be a good person. You can struggle with these things and still, not be a danger to society, or not be somebody that we should, treat differently than everybody else. It's just a thing. It's an injury. I don't want to say it's like breaking your leg, but it's something that you can deal with. It's something that you can say, yes, I have this, and I'm getting treatment, and I'm getting help for it, and I'm just a normal person who's a member of the rest of society. Now, the problem, though, is that if those soldiers, those veterans, are looking and they're saying, well, okay, but there also exists at this process. Maybe I go through a nasty divorce, and maybe my ex-spouse decides to initiate something like this against me, right? Because we all see how nasty divorce cases get, and we all see how wild accusations tend to fly around in a nasty divorce. So let's say that happens, and then this person could say he's getting treatment, or she, as the case may be, is getting treatment for PTSD. And now the court takes that under advisement. That's wide open case. Does this now make people who are gun owners, who value their Second Amendment rights, think to themselves, maybe I should think twice about whether or not I should get assistance for my PTSD? Maybe I should think twice before I get assistance for my depression. Because at some point in the future, that may be used against me in a proceeding to deny me my Second Amendment rights, which I value. I'm one of the millions and millions of Americans who value my Second Amendment rights, and I don't want it to be used against me. Therefore, I will forego that help. Now, maybe some of you are listening to this and saying, well, that sounds a little far-fetched, Rob, but is it? I mean, these red flag laws are getting a lot of attention, right? Their existence on the books can change how people behave. And it all gets back to my original point, is that there just aren't a lot of protections in this process. We are treating, and this is the primary thrust of my argument against the red flag law, we are treating gun rights cavalierly with this sort of legislation. We are treating it in a way that we're saying we're going to create a very low standard without a lot of protections for the person we're saying is dangerous. And we're going to subject them to this process and be able to take away their guns. Now, law enforcement loves this, and I don't mean to besmirch the reputation of law enforcement, but police a lot of times tend to look at these issues myopically. And the only thing that police tend to care about is public safety. And they have a hard time, I think, balancing the idea of public safety, because that's all they see. They work with it day in, day out. They're working with people who are, in the worst moments of their lives. And so that's their perspective. That's law enforcement's perspective. And they're saying, well, this would be okay. And I think law enforcement a lot of times has a hard time balancing the realities of their job with the realities that if we want to live in a free society, we've got to be able to protect people's rights. There's a reason why calling something a police state is a pejorative. There's a reason why none of us want to live in a police state, because we don't want to live in a situation where public safety, security interests constantly trump all other considerations, such as our ability to express ourselves or our ability to go around armed and arm ourselves and be able to exercise our Second Amendment rights. The red flag law, I'm not, and I think I even acknowledged this when I had Representative Hanson on the podcast previously. I said that I was on the fence about this bill. And the reason why I was on the fence at the time, because I was still learning about it, is because I'm not necessarily against this concept. I'm not against a process which allows us to get guns away from somebody who might be a danger to themselves or others. The thing is I am for a much higher bar than what this legislation sets. I think this legislation simply makes it too easy. And therefore it shouldn't pass, or it shouldn't pass at least without heavy amendment. And I don't know what those amendments could be. I think this is still an area of public policy we're wrestling with. But I will tell you that what Representative Hanson has proposed is not good enough. That's it for my rant. We're going to go on to our interview with North Dakota Petroleum Council President Ron Ness. Stay tuned. Ron Ness, president of the North Dakota Petroleum Council, joins me. Ron, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic today, Rob.
Well, good. Your organization, partnered with the Western Dakota Energy Association, put out a report today about oil tax revenues. Now, I will say I follow this stuff closely. I watch the budget. I follow the political process and the legislative process very, very closely. I will tell you, I was surprised by some of the numbers that this report detailed. Some of the top line findings from 2007 to 2018, over the course of a decade, 44% of all taxes collected by the state were from just the production tax and the extraction tax on the oil industry. Over the last 5 fiscal years, 50% of all taxes collected by the state were from those sources. Now, I think it's very, very important to make clear, we're just talking about direct taxes on the oil industry. That 50% figure over the last 5 years, that doesn't include the oil industry's impact on the sales tax. It doesn't include the oil industry's impact on income taxes. Now, obviously, we know the oil industry because it drives a lot of commerce. It hires, the industry hires a lot of people, pays a lot of salaries, that they drive revenues into those other streams as well. But before we even start counting that, we're already at the industry paying 50% directly of all taxes collected by the state. Ron, that is a surprising number. There's a lot of people. I can tell you right now, I'm looking at my blog, the post I just wrote about it earlier today, getting a lot of traffic, a lot of attention, a lot of people surprised by this.
Well, Rob, this is a report. Certainly, I've never seen these numbers aggregated like this. And it was an idea actually that came up in the Western counties. And, you continually hear the question, well, what's oil doing for us? And, I'm from Nelson County and central eastern part of North Dakota. And, what's oil doing for me other than, driving great jobs and creating a good economy and creating a renaissance back to rural America and lowering our gasoline and diesel prices? Well, here it is. The fact alone that the industry has paid $18 billion in a decade, really since the onset of the Bakken, it's just staggering. And this is so interesting reading because people can go to taxstudy.ndenergy.org, taxstudy.ndenergy.org, and you can look at your county. And then you can go to let's just go to pick your favorite county, Rob. How about Renville County, a little county, total $59.5 million over the past decade. How much went into property tax? A little over $2 million. How much into water projects? $3.1 million. How much into education? $8.8 million. How much in the Outdoor Heritage Fund money went into that county? $147,000. Transportation projects, roads, $11 million. And one-time other, which if you're in Grand Forks, that might be a law school, it might be a medical school, it might be a veterans hospital in Lisbon, $11 million. And then, of course, the king of all, you go to Cass County, where we're seeing these bills to raise the oil tax from, $820 million, just about $821 million has flowed into Cass County out of the oil and gas production taxes. Of course, that leads all other counties. So simply astounding, but good information for local taxpayers to understand, what's this done to my property taxes? Can you imagine, Rob, what what it would have taken in property tax increases to fund infrastructure, water, education, transportation, and property tax buy-down, had it not been for this revenue source. So it's good data. It's something we're going to be able to keep an active, live process going forward. People will be able to see, I'm not getting any of the Outdoor Heritage Fund in northeastern North Dakota. Okay, let's go to Walsh County. Walsh County, 400,000. No. Well, let's see, more than that. Walsh County, 493,000 of Outdoor Heritage Fund monies, and that program has only been in substance since 2013. Pretty incredible. Big money, staggering amounts of money.
It is a huge amount of money, and I think it is interesting because it's a little complicated how we handle oil tax revenues, because it's not like this money. In fact, the bulk of it does not just get dumped into the legacy fund. Revenues from the oil industry that flow into into the general fund are capped actually by statute. Most of this goes into things like the legacy fund or the various other buckets, I think we call them, that are set up. And so because of that, I think sometimes the public gets a little confused. They say, well, we've got all this oil tax revenue. How is it going? Well, here it is. Here's the map. Here's the tree. This is how all that money is trickling down into the various aspects of government. And I think it was really interesting because in your press release, you said the reason why you folks did this is you wanted to inform our lawmakers, who of course are in Bismarck, making budget decisions and policy decisions, and you wanted to inform the public. And to me, I think there's a lot of ways in which it can help. But to me, two of the most pressing ways are, one, like you mentioned, we have a couple of bills coming out from Fargo area lawmakers, a couple of Democrats. As a matter of fact, on a previous episode, I interviewed one of them, State Senator Merrill Pepcorn, Democrat from Fargo. The other is State Representative Pamela Anderson from Fargo as well, Democrat. Their bills, they want to restore the extraction tax from 5% back up to 6.5%. Now, some of the reaction when I wrote about that, some of the reaction I've seen on the internet is people saying, well, tax the oil industry. We got to fund roads, we got to fund schools, tax the oil industry. Your report is saying, hey, listen, we're already paying 50% of all the taxes collected in North Dakota, and that money is already going to all sorts of useful things like water projects, like education, like the Outdoor Heritage Fund, like one-time projects like the medical school. It's already happening, Ron.
Well, you're exactly right, and I think that the question is do you have a revenue problem or a spending problem? That's a question that taxpayers across the state can now see before them. Secondly, how reliant do you want to come? We tried this in the early 1980s. That the people raised the oil extraction tax by 130%. Prices fell, industry ran away to invest elsewhere. And then by 1987, Democratic House, Democrat Senate, Republican House, and Democrat governor put in the oil tax triggers. Why? Because they wanted to incentivize industry back here. And we went through a very dark period in the late 80s where we had to raise taxes on essentially every tax type in order to fund North Dakota, because in the early 1980s, they thought, well, we'll just raise the tax on oil and nobody's got to worry anymore, right? We're all going to be good. We're going to have golden roads and the best schools, and it's going to all be paid by the oil and gas industry, and it goes to thousands of mineral owners. But no industry works like that, and you don't grow the pie by continuing to overtax those growth industries. In fact, I would suggest that you lower the tax more, you even get more investment, and you get more tax revenues. But one of the things about this study, which I hope people will take a look at, is there's a lot of discussion on the legacy fund right now, and I was one of the founders of the legacy fund concept and the initiated measure and the constitutional measure. But that truly, in my opinion, the principle of the legacy fund was designed to restore and replace oil tax revenues when these revenue streams decline. Because how in the world can our 750,000 citizens generate a tax revenue base like this without taxing ourselves right out of business or right out of people wanting to live here? We saw that in the 80s. We've got to have a way to trickle. Eventually, oil production will decline. It may be 40 years, it may be 60 years, but we ought to learn from the Norwegians. They've got a $1 trillion fund, and it funds a big portion of their government like oil does today. And if we're so greedy that $18 billion hasn't been enough in the last decade in this state, and we got to tap into that corpus of that principle, we're not looking forward to our children's futures in this state.
Well, I think that's right. And that's one thing. I think the other area of policy, you hit on it a little bit, but we talk a lot about wanting to, lower other taxes. When I hear that we're getting 50% of our revenue from the oil industry over the last 5 fiscal years, which is what your report shows, based on publicly available data from the government, by the way, that these are not estimates, these are not projections or anything like that. This is just collecting the data and putting it into a report. So this is reliable data. When I hear that, to me, it's a little bit bittersweet. I like it because it means we have a thriving industry in our state that's successful, that's employing a lot of people, that's bringing a lot of investment here, that's doing a lot of wonderful things, and that's good. But when it's 50%, I also feel like, gosh, we are a little bit in all of our eggs in one basket scenario, and that could be a problem. Like you mentioned, 30, 40, 50 years down the line, when the industry, maybe it starts to decline at that point, what do we do? Are we going to be situated? And, I think part of that is diversifying our economy. I want to do everything that we're currently doing with oil and more if possible, but I'd like to be doing other things in our state as well. We've got to have a more diverse economy. If all of our eggs are in the oil basket, I think even you, Ron, is admitting that's not going to end well for us.
I would agree completely, and that's one of the things that I in the legacy fund earnings that I look at, and I think that should be used to try to grow our tax base. It should be legacy projects. It should not be used to plug budget holes, by the way. That should be used to try and grow our economy, diversify our economy, expand our economy, whether it's research into various things, whether it's a petrochemical type industry, whether it's whatever that might be. It's critically important. And the other thing is, we will as an industry stand opposed to eliminating the income tax. We can have people show you firsthand what's happened in Wyoming and Alaska when they eliminated their income tax and revenues dropped. You lower it all you want, don't get rid of it, because just 2 years ago, had oil not risen, Rob, and had that trigger not been removed, and we put that $1 billion back into the state budget, and oil not increased, we would have had to come up with around $800 million last legislative session.
Oh, we
and it was a rough session.
Yeah.
I don't know how we would have done it. It was a rough session the way it was.
Yeah.
But oil recovered just in time. Plus, you had those triggers gone, and it's something that is very easy, as you discussed with an earlier speaker. Very easy to forget the other side of the story there, and you want to grow an industry, you just can't continue to say, well, we're gonna take this away from you, and then, oh, by the way, we're gonna raise your tax. That wasn't a sweetheart deal for us by any means. We wanted 9.25%. We ended up with 10 and a high tax trigger that nobody talks about. The price is extremely high for, I believe it's 3 months. Tax goes up. So that did not turn out to be a good deal for us, but it provided revenue certainty for the state. That's important for us to invest into infrastructure and things like that. But back to the report, I think it's a great data source for the people of North Dakota and policymakers, and you can kind of see where the money's coming, and then maybe go ask what have we done with it in our county, in our community, and our school, and so and it can show that the state truly has engaged in property tax buy down on a big amount. We don't, as taxpayers, we don't always see that.
I think it shows too that that your industry is sufficiently taxed too. Because we're having that debate all the time where people are, big Harold. In fact, I just saw in the blog comments today, somebody said, well, Harold Hamm could pay another 1.5%. Listen, pal, the industry is already paying 50% of all the taxes. We're at a point now where, that's not even wise from a policy standpoint. We're doing fine there. We've got to make some policy choices here. But, again, I think having this data out there just cuts through some of the rhetoric about, how. What I think is amazing, if we could talk about these proposals to raise the extraction tax, I like it when they talk about how they talk about it like you guys got a handout from the state, right? Like you guys got some big tax cut. The latest numbers I've seen from the tax commissioner's office, the oil industry has paid $1 billion more in oil extraction and production taxes than they would have under the under the old regime. $1 billion in additional taxes is what you paid.
It was $1 million a day for 30 months. And when you look at the oil price and you look at, okay, what's considered, I still consider, with our technology improvements and stuff, you still better have $55 oil. Because below that, and you will see a slowdown even now in terms of what has happened a little bit. You will see things back off a little bit, high cost operations in North Dakota. And, you talked about Harold Hamm and Continental Resources. They've got 8 rigs operating in North Dakota. They're gonna trim that back because of the lower oil prices. They've got 20 in Oklahoma. Tax rates a bit lower in Oklahoma. I think they just increased it to about, on average, about 7, typically 5. But they don't have the high winter operating costs there, and they're drilling great wells. So that's significant capital. We're spending $20 million a day of economic inputs into the drilling and exploration. $20 million a day right now. So you can quickly disincentivize that next dollar coming here versus going somewhere else. We're at a point in the industry, and I'm not saying, everything's going to run away, but just a couple of those decisions here and there makes a big difference for North Dakota-based service companies and employers. Sales tax revenues, less completions. Those things all add to that economic bottom line. So, and the other thing, don't forget, everybody that owns minerals pays this tax. Farmers, ranchers, tens of thousands of North Dakotans who receive over about $200 million a year on the North Dakota side pay this tax. So just taxing them to reduce the tax on burden on everybody else, it's not fair.
Ron, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Rob. Have a great day.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Thank you all for listening. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday at 8 a.m., although I missed this last Friday. I was off. Hey, sometimes guys got to take a day off. Also, if you want to subscribe to the podcast, all of the options out there are available to you. I use Pocket Cast. That's the podcasting app that I use. I listen to podcasts constantly. If you're not using one, maybe that's worth looking at. Of course, we're on iTunes, or I guess Apple Podcasts, whatever they're calling it now. The Google Play Store, Google Podcasts. We should be pretty much everywhere. There's also an RSS feed. If you go to sayanythingblog.com, the RSS feed link is there. It's under the Plain Talk podcast link up at the top on the menu. You'll find the RSS. If you need the RSS feed, some podcast players required if you want to plug it in, if maybe we're not listed yet. Of course, if you have any feedback on the show, or you're having any trouble listening or subscribing, email me at rob@sayanythingblog.com. I'm happy to help you out. Also, one interesting thing, a lot of you I noticed have been rating the podcast on iTunes. There's been about a half dozen so far. I really appreciate that. If you want to drop by Apple Podcasts or at the iTunes store, rate us, leave a review. That sure helps us out. Or rate us or leave us a review if your podcasting service of choice allows that sort of thing. Certainly feel free to do it there as well. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.